This story is a dramatized reflection, inspired by common family dynamics. Names, timelines, and details have been adapted for storytelling purposes. I was sitting in a narrow orthopedic exam room in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a diagram of a knee while a doctor spoke with the careful calm people use when they don't want to scare you. He explained that most of the surgery would be covered by insurance, but not all of it. There was a deductible, a scheduling fee, and an out-of-network gap that had to be paid up front. $5,000. Not the full cost, just the part that unlocked the calendar. If the deposit wasn't placed within 10 days, the slot would disappear, and I would be pushed back months, long enough for permanent damage to become a real possibility. I nodded as if this was normal, as if bodies and finances always moved on predictable timelines. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't angry. I felt oddly practical, like someone solving a logistical problem rather than facing a medical one. I remember thinking that I had done everything right. I had worked, paid into the system, followed the rules, and carried my own weight. This wasn't about asking someone to save me. It was about asking for help navigating a system I had already paid into for years. When I walked out of the clinic, the late winter air felt sharper than it should have, and I realized I was already rehearsing explanations in my head. Not excuses, explanations. The kind you give when you don't want to sound dramatic or needy. I told myself this was temporary, that families step in when things get tight, that this was exactly the kind of moment people mean when they say, "Call us if you need anything." I believed that because it had always been easier to believe it than to test it. I didn't imagine arguments or raised voices. I imagined calm conversations, shared understanding, a bridge over a short gap. There was no sense of betrayal yet, no sense of loss, just a quiet confidence that help would arrive before the deadline did. Looking back, that confidence was the most fragile thing in the room, and I didn't know it yet. It sat there, unchallenged, shaped by years of being told I was capable, adaptable, the one who would figure it out. I didn't hear cruelty in that belief. I heard expectation, the kind that sounds like trust until the moment it becomes a test you didn't agree to take. At the time, all I felt was time pressing forward, a calendar quietly closing, and the assumption that the people who had always praised my independence would recognize when independence needed support. I didn't know I was standing at the beginning of a lesson about favoritism, boundaries, and dignity. I only knew that 10 days is not a lot of time when your body is waiting, and hope, even reasonable hope, can be thinner. I grew up understanding my place in the family long before anyone ever explained it out loud. James was spoken about in terms of potential, investment, and future payoff. Every risk he took was framed as courage, every setback as part of a larger plan. My parents used language with him that sounded like faith. They talked about timing, momentum, and how success sometimes needed patience and funding. When he struggled, it was treated as temporary turbulence on a promising flight path. Rachel and I listened from the edges of those conversations. Rachel was described as sweet, creative, and impractical. A word that sounded harmless until you realized it always meant support would come with conditions. Her dreams were tolerated, not financed. I occupied a quieter category. I was reliable, low maintenance, the one who figured things out without asking. That label came with praise, but it also came with an invisible ceiling. I didn't need as much because I never asked for much. I learned early that asking changed how people looked at you. Responsibility became my currency. If something broke, I fixed it. If money ran tight, I adjusted. I was proud of that once. It felt like adulthood. What I didn't see then was how those roles hardened over time. They stopped being descriptions and became expectations. James was cushioned because he was considered fragile in his growth. Rachel was limited because she was considered unrealistic. I was stretched because I was considered capable. None of this was discussed as favoritism. It was discussed as fairness. Each of us receives what we supposedly needed most. The problem with that logic is that it never updates. It doesn't account for emergencies, exhaustion, or the moment when the reliable one actually needs help. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern was already set. I didn't resent it. I translated it. I told myself this was just how families worked. Someone had to be steady. Someone had to be the backup plan. I didn't notice how often I was the only one expected to absorb risk quietly. I learned to measure my worth by how little space I took, how efficiently I solved problems without disturbing anyone else. Independence was praised so often that it became a rule rather than a trait. Needing help felt like failure, even when circumstances were clearly larger than one person. It shaped my expectations quietly and trained me to accept imbalance as normal for years without question or protest at all inside. When I look back now, I can see how careful the balance was, how gently it was maintained. They worried about James landing. They assumed I always would. I didn't call my parents in a panic. I waited until I had the information straight, until I could explain it calmly and clearly, the way responsible adults are supposed to. When I told them about the surgery, there was no immediate refusal. There was a pause, the kind that sounds thoughtful rather than cruel. My father asked if insurance could stretch it, if there was any way to spread the cost out. My mother wondered aloud whether the hospital might be willing to wait a few weeks, maybe even a month. Their questions sounded reasonable, even caring, and for a moment, I felt relief. This was how problems got solved. Through discussion, through options. I explained what the doctor had said, that the insurance portion was already maximized, that the $5,000 wasn't negotiable, and that the slot would be released if the deposit wasn't placed within 10 days. I kept my voice even. I didn't exaggerate the risk or dramatize the pain. I framed it the way I had learned to frame everything, as a logistical hurdle rather than a crisis. The conversation stayed polite. No one raised their voice. No one sounded angry. That was what made the shift so subtle when I said there wasn't flexibility. My mother sighed softly, not in frustration, but in disappointment, as if I'd missed a more responsible solution. She said she and my father had talked, and that they just didn't think stepping in would help me long term. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. This wasn't about money, she explained. It was about principles, about learning to manage unexpected challenges, about becoming stronger through self-reliance. I listened, nodding even though they couldn't see me, absorbing the language the way I always had. I pointed out that this wasn't a pattern of dependence, that I wasn't asking them to fix my life, just to help me bridge a very specific gap. My father agreed that it was unfortunate, but said that sometimes pressure forces growth. He reminded me how capable I'd always been, how I had a way of figuring things out. The compliment felt rehearsed. What struck me wasn't what they said, but what they didn't ask. They didn't ask how much pain I was in. They didn't ask what would happen if the surgery was delayed. They didn't ask whether I was scared. Their focus stayed on character, on resilience, on long-term outcomes, as if this were a theoretical exercise rather than something happening to my body right now. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused. I kept thinking there would be a pivot, a moment where concern would override philosophy. It didn't come. The conversation ended the way many of ours did, with reassurance that I'd find a way, that things had a way of working out for people like me. When we hung up, I sat in silence, replaying the call, trying to locate the exact point where help had quietly turned into a lesson I hadn't asked for, and realizing that no one had technically said no, but no one had said yes either. It wasn't until a few days later that the contrast became impossible to ignore. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't keeping score. It surfaced on its own, quietly, the way patterns usually do when you stop rushing past them. My mother mentioned in passing that James had called. He was thinking about repositioning his brand, she said, the words sounding practiced, like something she'd said before. The last venture hadn't worked out, but this one felt different. He just needed a little runway to get it off the ground. I listened, already familiar with that language. Runway meant money without pressure, time without consequences, space to fail without falling. When I asked how much help he needed, there was no hesitation. They'd figure it out. She said, he was fragile right now. He'd been through a lot. The conversation drifted naturally, comfortably, as if we were discussing the weather. Later that same evening, my father checked in with me. He didn't ask about my knee. He asked how I was holding up in general. When I mentioned the surgery timeline again, the tone shifted slightly. Not colder, just firmer. You're strong, he said, the way people do when they think they're offering reassurance. You'll adapt. You always do. I realized then that the same qualities were being used in opposite ways. James's uncertainty made him worthy of support. My resilience made me ineligible for it. When James struggled, it was framed as vulnerability. When I struggled, it was framed as growth. No one said this explicitly. No one needed to. The double standard lives in the assumptions. James needed cushioning because the fall might break him. I needed pressure because it supposedly made me better. The logic was neat and completely unexamined. I started replaying past conversations with new ears. How often has strength been used as a reason to step back rather than step in? How often my ability to cope had been treated as proof that I should. This wasn't cruelty. That's what made it harder to name. It was a philosophy. A belief system that rewarded dependence in one direction and self-sufficiency in another, all while calling itself fairness. I didn't confront them. I didn't argue. I just listened. Something in me shifted from confusion to clarity. Not anger. Not yet. But a quiet recognition that the rules were not the same for everyone, and they never had been. That recognition didn't demand action. It simply settled in, changing how I heard every compliment and every reassurance after that. Have you noticed how strength only counts when you're the one not being helped? Rachel didn't rush in with emotion or speeches. She waited until she had facts. When she came to see me, she didn't sit on the edge of the bed or ask how I felt first. She asked what the deadline was, what the exact number covered, and whether there were penalties if the deposit came in parts. I told her everything the clinic had explained. She listened, quiet, focused, the way she always had been when something mattered. Then she said she wanted a night to run the numbers. The next evening, she came back with a plan. She told me she could pause school for one semester without losing her place. She had already checked. The tuition she'd paid could be partially refunded, and the rest could be credited if she returned on schedule. She showed me the email. She said she could sell her laptop, the one she used for classes and freelance work, and switched to full-time retail for a few months. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't impulsive. It was measured. She had accounted for rent, transportation, and groceries. She had left a margin for mistakes. When I asked her why she was doing this, she didn't say family. She said time. She said if we missed the window, the cost would be higher later, in ways no spreadsheet could fix. There was no heroism in her voice, just clarity. Rachel had always been described as impractical, the creative one, the dreamer. Watching her lay out the plan, I realized how shallow that label had been. This wasn't recklessness. It was prioritization. She wasn't sacrificing everything. She was choosing what could be paused and what could not. She treated my surgery like a real constraint, not a character test. I told her she didn't have to do this, that I would figure something out. She shook her head and said she wasn't saving me. She was reallocating resources. She said people do that all the time when they believe something matters. The simplicity of that reframing hit me harder than any argument could have. She wasn't positioning herself as a rescuer or a martyr. She was acting as a peer. Someone is making a rational decision in response to risk. The money came together in pieces, a refund here, a sale there, longer shifts at a store that didn't care about her long-term plans. She never complained. She never asked for credit. She just updated me on progress, like we were managing a project together. That was the moral anchor I hadn't known I needed. Not someone proving love through pain, but someone demonstrating it through responsibility. Rachel's help didn't make me feel smaller. It restored something that had been quietly eroded. Dignity. She treated my need as legitimate, not instructive, as present, not theoretical. Watching her make space for me without drama or judgment showed me how distorted the other responses had been. It wasn't that help was impossible. It was that it had been selectively withheld. That realization didn't ignite anger. It settled into resolve. I understood then that justice doesn't always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through contrast. When one person quietly shows you what care actually looks like, and you can never unsee the difference again. Once that contrast settled, memories I had filed away as unrelated began lining up with uncomfortable precision. I wasn't searching for evidence. I wasn't building a case. I was simply noticing how often the same rules bent in the same direction. A few years earlier, when my car's transmission failed, I had asked my parents for a loan to cover the repair so I could keep getting to work. It wasn't an emergency in the dramatic sense, but it was urgent in the practical one. They agreed to help, but only after my father printed out a simple agreement. We went over interest, a repayment schedule, and expectations. My mother insisted it be signed, not because they didn't trust me, she said, but because structure builds responsibility. I signed without hesitation. It seemed fair. I paid them back ahead of schedule. At the time, I took pride in how cleanly it had been handled, how adult it felt. I didn't think to compare it to anything else. Not long after that, James lost a significant amount of money on a business idea that never got traction. I remember the conversation because of how casual it was. There was no paperwork, no timeline, no discussion about lessons or accountability. My parents framed it as support during a rough patch. He needed cushioning, they said. He'd already taken enough hits. The money moved quietly, without conditions, and the subject was closed. At the time, I told myself the situations were different. Of course, they were different. Everything always was. But as I replayed those moments now, the distinctions began to feel less meaningful than the pattern they formed. When I needed help, it came with structure and expectations designed to make me stronger. When James needed help, it came with softness and trust designed to protect him. The intent was never stated as favoritism. It was presented as fairness, each child receiving what they needed most. But that definition never shifted, no matter how circumstances changed. I began to notice how often responsibility was treated as a virtue only when it was mine. How often was it praised right up until it required support? I had been taught to see pressure as proof of confidence, and that belief had kept me from questioning why pressure was applied so selectively. None of this was malicious. That's what made it difficult to name for so long. There were no cruel words or dramatic confrontations to point to, just a consistent tilt in how protection was distributed. Looking back, I realized how much effort I had spent smoothing over the imbalance, translating it into something palatable. I told myself that being reliable was a gift, that not needing help was a form of strength. I ignored how often that narrative asked me to absorb risk quietly, while others were shielded from it. As these memories surfaced, they didn't trigger anger so much as clarity. The pattern wasn't hidden anymore. It was coherent. It explained the recent refusal without making it personal or emotional. It placed it exactly where it belonged, inside a long-standing system of assumptions about who needed cushioning and who could do without it. That realization didn't make me feel wronged. It made me feel finished with pretending it was random. This wasn't about money. It was about who deserved cushioning. The surgery itself went as scheduled. The morning was quiet and procedural, the kind that feels unreal until you're already changed into a gown and signing forms you've read twice. Rachel stayed with me until they wheeled me back, then went straight to work for her shift, promising to check in later. When I woke up, groggy and sore, there was a brief window where everything narrowed to breath and pain and the steady reassurance of machines doing what they were supposed to do. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my parents. Hope recovery is going well, followed by a heart emoji that felt carefully chosen. I stared at it longer than I should have. There was no call, no questions about what the doctor had said, no curiosity about the timeline or the pain management, or whether I needed anything picked up. Just that line, neat and complete, as if it closed the loop. I told myself it was enough. People show care differently. They were giving space. That night was harder. Pain has a way of amplifying absence. I checked my phone more than once, even though I knew nothing else was coming. The next day passed quietly. Rachel stopped by after work, tired but attentive, helping me adjust pillows and reminding me about medication. She asked specifics. She wrote things down. 2 days later, my mother sent another message asking if I was up and moving yet. I replied honestly. Slowly. She responded with a thumbs up. Around the same time, my father mentioned in a group text that they'd booked James a ticket to Austin for a conference he'd been talking about. It was a good opportunity, he said. Lots of networking potential. They wanted to make sure he didn't miss it. I read the message from my bed, ice pack balanced carefully, incisions still tender. The contrast was sharp but quiet. No one was doing anything wrong exactly. They were being supportive, just not to me, not in the ways that mattered in that moment. They followed up about James's travel detailed asked if he needed anything else covered, and reminded him to bring business cards. No one asked if I needed help getting to a follow-up appointment. No one called to hear how I sounded. The messages kept their distance, polite and minimal, like correspondence rather than care. That hurt more than if there had been nothing at all. Silence would have been easier to interpret. This was something else. It was attention, allocated with precision. They checked if James could network. They assumed I could heal. Lying there, I understood that this was the practical consequence of everything that had come before. The philosophy didn't stop at money. It extended into presence. Support was offered where it was expected to yield returns. Resilience was assumed where it was convenient. I didn't feel angry. I felt strangely calm, as if the picture had finally come into focus. This wasn't neglect. It was prioritization. And once I saw it that way, I stopped waiting for care to arrive in forms it never had. That realization didn't make the recovery easier, but it made it clearer. I knew then that healing would have to include more than my body. It would have to include my expectations. The gathering wasn't planned as a confrontation. It was small, familiar, the kind of family moment that exists mostly out of habit. A Sunday afternoon, a shared meal, people asking polite questions because that's what you do when time has passed, and no one wants to reopen anything. I was still moving carefully. Not fully recovered, but functional enough to sit at the table. The conversation drifted the way it always had. Light updates, work schedules, James talking about Austin and the connections he'd made. My parents listened with interest, asking follow-up questions, nodding at the right moments. When the subject turned to me, it was brief. "How are you feeling now?" "Better every day." That was enough. Then my mother said it. Not defensively, not dramatically, just as a reflex. "We helped where we could." The sentence hung in the air, neat and self-contained, a summary she seemed comfortable with. No one reacted at first. It wasn't framed as a claim. It was a conclusion. I felt my body tense, not with anger, but with the instinct to smooth things over. That instinct had been trained into me. I opened my mouth, ready to translate, to soften, to keep the moment moving. Rachel spoke before I could. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't sharp. She didn't look at my parents when she said it. She looked at me. "You didn't." "I did." That was it. No explanation followed. No list of sacrifices. No reminder of the numbers, the timeline, or what she had put on hold. She didn't correct the phrasing or ask for acknowledgement. She stated a fact and let it stand on its own. The table went quiet in a way that felt different from awkwardness. It wasn't explosive. It was still. My parents didn't argue. My mother blinked and smiled tightly, as if waiting for more. My father cleared his throat. James shifted in his chair. No one rushed to fill the silence. Rachel didn't elaborate. She reached for her water and took a sip. I sat there, aware of my heartbeat, aware of how exposed the moment felt, without anyone actually being attacked. This was the kind of exposure that doesn't come from accusations. It comes from contrast. The story my parents had been telling themselves met the reality they hadn't accounted for, and there was nowhere for it to go. My mother eventually said something about everyone doing their best. My father nodded. James looked at his phone. The conversation moved on, but it didn't recover. Something had shifted, not loudly, permanently. What stayed with me wasn't the silence itself, but what happened around it. No one tried to reframe Rachel's words. No one asked her to clarify. No one asked me to reassure them. They let the statement exist without fixing it. And that told me more than any argument could have. Later. As people gathered their things and prepared to leave, my mother hugged me carefully and said she was glad I was doing better. She didn't mention the surgery. She didn't mention the money. She didn't mention Rachel. There was a carefulness in her tone, as if she wasn't sure where the edges were anymore. That was the exposure. Not a scene, not a reckoning, not a victory. Just a truth spoken once, without decoration, and then allowed to remain unanswered. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. The story I had been carrying for years no longer needed defending. It had been witnessed. Watching that moment unfold taught me something important. When the truth is simple and unforced, it doesn't need backup. Watch who rushes to fix the story and who doesn't. The call came a few days after the gathering, early evening, the time my parents preferred for conversations that were meant to sound casual. My phone lit up with my father's name, and I felt that familiar tightening, not dread exactly, more like preparation. He didn't mention the surgery, he didn't mention money, he didn't mention Rachel. He spoke about the weather, about traffic, about how quickly time seemed to be moving lately. Then my mother took the phone. She said families don't need to air everything. Her tone was calm, almost concerned, as if she were offering guidance rather than making a request. She said misunderstandings happen, that things get said in the moment, and that it's better to smooth them over quietly. She didn't ask me to deny anything. She didn't ask me to clarify details. She asked me to help restore the version of events that felt more comfortable to them. I listened without interrupting. This wasn't anger or panic on their part. It was a strategy. They wanted the narrative settled, contained, returned to its usual shape. I realized then that this was the real audacity, not the refusal, not the uneven care, but the assumption that I would resume my role as translator and buffer, that I would make things easier by adjusting the story. When there was a pause, I spoke carefully. I said I wasn't airing anything. I said I was just not correcting it anymore. The words felt steady as I said them. Not rehearsed, not defiant, just accurate. There was silence on the other end. My mother asked what I meant. I explained that I wasn't adding details or assigning blame. I wasn't asking anyone to apologize. I was simply letting what had been said stand as it was. She said that wasn't how families worked. I said maybe it was how this one had worked so far. My father cleared his throat and said everyone had done their best. I agreed. That was true. What I didn't agree to was the cleanup. The call ended politely. No one raised their voice. No one threatened distance. That's what made it different from conflict. This wasn't about punishment. It was about control. They wanted the comfort of a corrected narrative without addressing the reality that had disrupted it. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. For the first time, I wasn't responsible for maintaining the family story. I wasn't tasked with making everyone look better or feel settled. Justice, I realized, didn't require confrontation or exposure beyond what had already happened. It required withdrawing my labor from a system that depended on it. By not correcting the record, I wasn't escalating anything. I was simply refusing to participate in the erasure of what had already been acknowledged. The consequences were subtle but real. Conversations became more careful. Assumptions were no longer voiced as freely. The silence that followed wasn't punitive. It was a recalibration. I understood then that dignity doesn't come from winning an argument. It comes from choosing what you will and will not carry forward. I wasn't airing anything. I was letting the truth exist without escort. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment or confrontation. They arrived as an absence. I stopped stepping in. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply didn't do the things I had always done without being asked. When my parents called with minor logistical questions, I answered politely but briefly. When conversations drifted toward smoothing over misunderstandings or coordinating plans, I let them resolve on their own. I wasn't withholding affection. I was withdrawing a service I had been providing for years without realizing it had become expected. The family rhythm changed quietly, without me translating intentions or anticipating needs. Small gaps appeared. Plans took longer to settle. Assumptions went uncorrected. It wasn't chaos. It was unfamiliar. James felt it first, when a follow-up opportunity from Austin didn't materialize the way he'd hoped. There was no automatic cushion waiting, no quiet transfer, no strategic reassurance framed as support. He had to make the calls himself, ask the questions himself, and decide what to do next without a buffer. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with curiosity. This was what self-reliance looked like when it wasn't selectively applied. He struggled, but he managed. That mattered, not because it proved a point, but because it showed the system could hold without me propping it up. My parents noticed the shift, too. They became more careful in how they spoke, less quick to summarize or conclude. They didn't accuse me of pulling away. They adjusted. That was the real consequence. Not loss, but recalibration. Meanwhile, I focused my energy where it felt clean. When Rachel was ready to return to school, I helped her navigate the paperwork she'd already researched. I covered a portion of the tuition she couldn't reclaim, not as repayment, but as a partnership. We mapped out timelines together, practical and calm. Supporting her didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt aligned. She had stepped in without judgment when I needed help. Now I stepped in without drama when she needed a bridge back. That symmetry mattered. It wasn't about settling accounts. It was about choosing where my care landed. As weeks passed, I noticed something unexpected. I felt steadier, not detached, but grounded. By letting go of the role I had been assigned, I wasn't diminishing the family. I was changing how I participated in it. Justice didn't look like anyone being corrected or embarrassed. It looked like boundaries were becoming visible through action rather than argument. The privileges I released weren't taken from anyone. They simply stopped being automatically available. In that space, everyone adjusted. The family continued, just differently. And in that difference, I found a quieter kind of peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer compensating for an imbalance that had never been mine to manage alone. With some distance, the pattern became easier to name, not as accusation, but as understanding. Favoritism doesn't survive confrontation. It survives translation. I had spent years translating discomfort into reason, imbalance into intention, neglect into philosophy. I smoothed rough edges before anyone else had to feel them. I explained away pauses. I reframed silences as trust. I accepted substitutions for care and called them independence. None of that was asked of me directly. I offered it because it felt easier than letting things stand as they were. I thought I was keeping the peace. What I was really doing was maintaining a system that didn't need to change, as long as someone was willing to absorb the friction. Once I stopped translating, nothing exploded. That was the surprising part. The story didn't collapse. It simply lost its polish. Conversations became less tidy. Motivations were no longer prepackaged. People had to sit with what they said, instead of having it reworded into something kinder or more reasonable. I saw then how often my own strength had been used as a resource, quietly extracted and redistributed in the name of balance. I had believed that being understanding was the same as being fair. It wasn't. Understanding without boundaries only made inequity easier to live with. Letting go of that role didn't turn me cold. It made it clearer. I didn't stop caring. I stopped compensating. There's a difference. Care is offered freely. Compensation is expected silently. When I stepped out of the translator role, I wasn't punishing anyone. I was returning responsibility to where it belonged. That shift didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. Moments that had once confused me now made sense. Compliments that had felt hollow revealed their function. Even the praise I'd accepted for being low maintenance carried a cost I hadn't named before. Reflection didn't arrive all at once. It came in small recognitions, during ordinary moments, when I noticed how much lighter conversations felt when I wasn't pre-editing them. I could listen without planning a response. I could hear without adjusting the tone. That quiet was not absence. It was space. Space to choose how I showed up, where I invested, and what I allowed to remain unaltered. Healing, I learned, didn't come from rewriting history or forcing acknowledgement. It came from withdrawing my participation in patterns that depended on my silence. Dignity wasn't reclaimed through confrontation. It was restored through alignment, when my actions matched my values. The internal friction eased. The story I tell myself now is simpler. I am not responsible for making things easier for everyone else at my own expense. I am responsible for being honest in how I engage. If something in this sounds familiar, if you've ever found yourself explaining away an imbalance to keep things smooth, it might be worth asking one quiet question. Who have you been translating for? Healing didn't arrive with a dramatic moment or a clear finish line. It arrived gradually, the way strength often does, through repetition and consistency. My knee healed fully. Physical therapy ended. I returned to running, first carefully, then with confidence. My body did what it was designed to do when it was finally given the support it needed. That recovery mirrored something internal. I didn't cut my family off. I still showed up for holidays, answered calls, and shared updates. What changed was the shape of my presence. I no longer stepped in to manage tone or anticipate reactions. I didn't volunteer explanations or soften truths before they were spoken. I let conversations land where they landed. At first, that felt uncomfortable, like leaving a room slightly unfinished. Over time, it felt honest. My parents adjusted in small ways. They asked fewer leading questions. They filled the silences themselves. James found his footing, unevenly at times, but on his own terms. Rachel finished the semester she'd returned for and started planning her next one with a steadiness that surprised even her. Our relationship shifted from rescue to mutual respect. None of this came from ultimatums or speeches. It came from consistency, from not returning to a role once I'd seen it clearly. I realized that staying connected didn't require self-abandonment. Distance wasn't the same as separation. Boundaries didn't mean hostility. They meant clarity. I could care without compensating. I could listen without fixing. I could love without translating. The family didn't fracture because I stopped absorbing the imbalance. It reorganized, and in that reorganization, I found space to be myself without apology. Justice, I learned, wasn't about being chosen or validated. It wasn't about finally being seen in the way I'd once hoped. Justice was quieter than that. I was choosing myself without needing permission. It was aligning my actions with what I knew to be true, even when that alignment removed me from familiar patterns. Healing didn't erase the past, but it loosened its grip. I no longer replay old conversations, wondering what I could have said differently. I understood now that the work I'd been doing had never been about words. It had been about roles. Once I stepped out of mine, the story changed on its own. Life moved forward. Not perfectly, not neatly, but honestly, if this story felt familiar, you're not alone.